everyone, this is Carissa with Summerlin Studios, and today we're going to talk about something a lot of you seem to be interested in, and something that I use myself actually, and this has been something that really has been helpful for my business, and that is connecting your CRM into Notion. So I'm going to do this demonstration using Dubsado, but as long as your CRM does allow integrations and works with Zapier, it should work very similarly. It might have slightly different triggers or things like that, but you should be able to do the same sort of thing. And if you're stuck and you're trying to get this to work with your particular one, I'm happy to help you if you need help. So what we're going to do today is specifically integrating with the client project tracker. So I'm actually going to split this video into two parts. And the first thing is going to just be creating the Zap to show you how that works. So it's a little bit more generic. And then the second half will be actually showing you how I use this with my client project tracker in Notion that I've created. And I don't know if you guys all have this issue also, but I love my CRM for being able to track things like an overall client status. And then I do also create to-do tasks in my CRM, but sometimes I want just sort of a checklist of the exact things that I need to do for each client. And there's no really easy way to do that in a CRM for me that doesn't make it hard to see on your screen as an overview or just kind of makes it clunky. So what I actually did is created a tracker in Notion, and I'll show you that quick. And it's really just a checklist. It's a smart checklist that allows me to go through and track specific information about each client so I can see exactly what I have done and haven't done, what their status is, and things like that. So that's a specific example, but like I said, I'll divide this into two videos in case you're just looking for a more generic idea of how to connect your CRM to Notion. So the Zapier account I'm using here is a free plan. I do personally have a paid plan, and some of the things that I do for my client tracker do involve using that paid plan. And generally the tipping point for me from the free to the paid is to get extra steps in your Zaps. So normally things like if I wanted to update an existing item versus create a new one, that is generally going to require the paid plan. So for this example of just creating the items in Notion, we're using the completely free plan from Zapier. You get a bunch of free Zaps. It'll show you your progress here. So you get 5 free Zaps and there's 100 free tasks within that. So to get you started on this, you can do this for completely free. And you can also do this with a free Notion account. Again, they do have limits on things like file storage and how many blocks you can use, but for what we're doing here, this can all be done in the free plan with Zapier and Notion. All right, so to start off with, we're going to create a Zap. And the first step is the trigger. So this is the thing that happens that we want to take action on, right? So for me, the first thing that I want to happen in my CRM to create an action here is when I create a project. So I don't necessarily want to do anything when a user or a lead gets created in my CRM because they might not be a lead who I actually end up booking with. And for me, I don't need to track that in Notion. If they're just a lead, that's fine. They can stay in my CRM and I can, follow up there or do whatever I need to there. But if I actually create a project for them in my CRM, then I want to have their project created in Notion. And then later on, I will do a video talking about updates. Like I said, that would take the paid plan, but you can do things like update the status in Notion when they pay an invoice or sign a contract or any of those sort of triggers also. But for right now, we're just saying when we create a project in Notion or create a project in Dubsado, we want to also create a project for that client in Notion. So we're going to search for Dubsado in here. And again, most CRMs are probably going to have integrations enabled, so you can try searching for yours. And then the event is, like I said, in this case is a new project as a job. So I don't want a new project as a lead because I do create projects for my leads. So I don't want any of this to happen for just a lead. I want it to only happen when it's an actual booked job. But you can do it for a lead. You could also do it for things like when they actually sign a contract. Maybe that's what your tipping point is for when you actually want to start tracking their progress. All right, so we've got our event. We're going to click continue. And then we need to connect our account. So if you click sign in, and if you're already signed into Dubsado here. It's going to tell you exactly where to go. So we're going to go to the brand settings page in our Dubsado account and get our API key. And then we'll see Notion here, and we're going to click Generate Tokens. And you'll see your option to generate a new token. And you're going to make sure you copy it here. Make sure it's actually copied. And then we will go back to our window and we will paste it in. And it will spin for a second, and then it's going to go ahead and your Dubsado will be connected. It's going to change. It should show your account name here. That lets you know that it's connected to Dubsado. So you can test your connection, make sure that everything is working, and then we'll click Continue. And then what we're going to do is test your trigger. So our trigger that we chose was having a project created as a job. So you'll want to make sure that you do have a recent project in that status in order to test this. If you don't, you can just create a test one. That's what I did for this. And we're going to click Test Trigger. And what it's going to do is it's going to pull a test project or whatever the most recent project is that meets that criteria from your Dubsado. And it's going to show you what the fields might look like. So for example, you can see my title, things like the start date, which is just a general date, but then also formatted in a nice way that so you can read it. And then any of these things, if they were filled in, would show up here. It's going to show you all this information that you have on your client and on your project. So that lets me know that this is correct. I know that's a project that I created. I know it was created as a job. So we'll continue with this, and this is the record that we're going to test our triggers with. So now we're going to select the action. So what we're doing here is we're updating Notion. So we're going to search for Notion. And then we're going to choose an event. And instead of a trigger, this time we're choosing an action. So the trigger is what starts your flow, what kicks off what's going to happen, and then the action is what you're going to do after that trigger happens. So you'll see we have a couple different options here. What we want to do in this case is create a database item. So you do have to have your database for your clients already created, and we're going to create a new client inside that database. And we'll click Continue. And then we're going to do the same thing with Notion. We need to connect our Notion account. So we'll click Sign In. So then it will pop this up. If you weren't logged in yet to Notion, it would ask you to log in. In this case, I want to connect it to my demo workspace. It's going to tell you what permissions it's looking for. In this case, this is fine. I do need it has to have the ability to be able to create content and edit pages to do this, so I'm fine with that. And then we can actually select which pages it has access to. So you don't have to give it access to your entire workspace, only to the actual pages that you need to update. And in this case, it is the client project tracker. So we are going to allow access. And we're going to give it a minute to think. And I'm going to caution you at this point, this is one issue that I do have with Notion is pretty much anytime I set up an integration, whether it's from Zapier or somewhere else, the permissions don't take effect immediately. So you might notice that it hasn't actually done this connection yet. So what I'm going to do, I know this is saving as a draft. I'm just going to make sure that I have this saved correctly. This is Dubsado to Notion projects. And then we'll make sure that's saved. And now that we know it's saved, I'm going to reload the page, and now you'll see that it's connected. We're going to test the connection just in case. Like I said, if it takes a minute or two to be able to do that connection, don't worry, but you might have to refresh the page to make sure that it's taking effect. So now we'll click Continue. So we gave Zapier access to whatever specific pages we wanted to. And at this point, we're going to go ahead and choose the database to connect it to. So if you're using this for a different use case, go ahead and choose whatever database you're looking for. If you want to use it for the client project tracker, in the second video for this, I will walk you through how to create this specific database. So you can actually do that first and then do the Zapier setup afterwards once you've got your database created. So we've got our database there. And give it a second. And then what it's going to do is populate all the fields in your database. So these are all the fields that are in my client status database. So if we pop back over here, you can get an idea of what these are. So in this case, the name is the client. We've got all these checkboxes. And what we want to do here, so to create the client name, we want to pull the client's name from Dubsado, right? We don't want to make this something manual. We want it to come over exactly as is and create it so that it matches what we've got in Dubsado. So in this case, I'm going to go with client name. That's first and last name. And for me, that's all I need to do here. And then if you wanted to call it something else, you could call it, first name, last name, project, or whatever you wanted to call it. Any of these fields you're pulling from Dubsado, you can go ahead and put in here. So if you wanted to actually pull the project title from Dubsado instead of the client's name, you can do that also. It's really whatever makes sense for your use case. But if you scroll through, you'll see all these different options here. So it's pulling all of my fields from my Notion database, which in my case are a bunch of checkboxes. So I don't want to check any of these off yet. I'm creating a brand new project from a new client. So none of these are done. So I don't need to check any boxes off yet at this point. So I'm going to ignore most of these fields. There are a couple things I do want to fill out. Include time with date fields. This is important for Notion because in Notion, when you create a date field, you have the option to include the time or not. For me, most of my project date information in Dubsado does have a time. So I do want to include the time information. That's important for me to have it. If your general dates are just dates, that might not be something important to you. So now the one field that I do want to include here for me is my project start date. So that is populated when I create the project. So I do want to make sure that this does get sent to Dubsado. You'll see, again, because of how dates work in Notion, you can have a start date and an end date. So if it's a range, you can include that. But in this case, I don't. It's just their project start date. It's a single date and time. So I'm just going to find that in my Dubsado data. So this is client information, and then this is my start date. So I'm going to select that. And again, if you had a range, but coming from a CRM, you probably don't. It's probably just a single date field. And then if you wanted to change any other fields, you can do that. These, like I said, are all my checkboxes that I don't want to do at this point. And then because I have text fields in Notion, I can also choose the format here. So you can either do plain text or markdown. Markdown gives you the option to format it. So if you have formatted text that you're putting in there, you'd want to choose that. In this case, I'm not populating that field, so that's not something that I'm going to set at this point. And since I've got those fields set, I'm going to click continue. And now it's going to show me the fields that I did select and then all the ones I didn't. So this, I selected my database. I named my database entry. I filled in the start date and I told it that I do want to use time. So I want to include the start time with my start date in that field. And then all these other fields are empty, which is fine. And then we're going to test it. So again, it's going to pull that test data from your Dubsado that we saw above, and it's going to attempt to create this project. So it's going to show you all this information, and then it's actually going to send this over to Notion and attempt to do that insert for you, and you can go and look at the data and see if it's correct. In my case, it's telling me it was sent to Notion, so there were no errors. All my connections are still working correctly. So I can hop over to Notion and see what happened. And you'll see it just created this new project. And The other field I selected here was the project start date, so it pulled in my project start date, which was in Dubsado, and added the time, which is important. I did want the time. And then all my other fields are blank because I left them blank. So in this case, it's just a creation, and it set that field exactly how I wanted it to. So let me just show you quickly how if we wanted to do other fields, we could do that too. So say for this scenario, I know when I create a project, I want to also check off a box. Let's see. So I want to create client workspace. So say, for example, the client workspace is what's being created by this app. So I say, yes, I do want to check this off. It's already done. Once this runs, their workspace is created. I'm all set. So I'm going to select this as true. Again, we'll click continue. And we want to retest the action. Let it spin. And it sent this over to Notion again. So here's our new example. We've got our project start date. But you'll see in this case, it did check off create client workspace for us. So now we've got this new thing created, and I can check off any of these boxes that I want to, put any information in that I want to pull from Dubsado into my Notion project. And then our last step here is to publish it. And once it's published, anytime you create that new project as a job in Dubsado, it will go ahead and create that for you in Notion. And the nice thing about Zapier also is you'll get an email if that happens. You'll get an email if it fails, if something errors, just so you're not missing anything that's supposed to happen that isn't. So this can just take some of the time out of manually creating those projects for your clients in Notion. Or you can even go a step further and make something like this client project tracker. So if you want to see more about that, go to part 2. I'll show you how to create the client project tracker in Notion and also how to do some advanced Zapier so that we can make updates, so we can check some of those boxes off when the people do things like sign a contract, pay an invoice, whatever it is that you want to track, and it can actually check some of those boxes off for you and create even more automation that can save you some time. Thanks for watching.